Pints with Jack, Season 4, Episode 43. After Hours with Carolyn Curtis. Welcome, everyone. Pints with Jack is your weekly C.S. Lewis podcast where Matt, Andrew, and I break down and discuss the works of C.S. Lewis. This season, we're eavesdropping on the correspondence of a senior demon, Screwtape, as he explains how to tempt the patient, a human assigned to be tempted by Screwtape's nephew, Wormwood. Each week, we'll be considering a different letter, untwisting Screwtape's hellish logic, and forming a battle plan for our own spiritual lives. However, today is a Thursday, and it's therefore an After Hours episode. Today we're talking to Carolyn Curtis about a book which she co-edited with Dr. Mary Pomeroy Key called Women and C.S. Lewis. Carolyn Curtis holds a Bachelor of Journalism degree from the University of Texas at Austin and a Master of Arts degree in Communication from the Stephen F. Austin State University. She's taught journalism at college and been a speaker at numerous conferences. She has reported from daily newsrooms and from Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. She's worked as in communication management for Fortune 50 companies and at domestic corporate headquarters for 2 major church denominations. Carolyn is the author and collaborator of 7 books, and today she's here to talk to us about a book which she co-edited called Women and C.S. Lewis, What His Life and Literature Reveal for Today's Culture. Carolyn Curtis, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
So, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the show, but each episode we share a quote, a drink, and a toast. And for the quote of the week, I thought I'd share the epitaph which C.S. Lewis wrote for his wife, Joy. Here the whole world, stars, water, air, and field and forest as they were, reflected in a single mind, like cast-off clothes was left behind, in ashes yet with hopes that she, reborn from holy poverty, in Lenten lands hereafter may, rescue them on her Easter day. The next thing we've got is our drink of the week, and today I'm getting back to my Yorkshire roots with a nice cup of Yorkshire Gold. Carolyn, are you drinking anything?
I actually have 2 things here. I have a cup of tea. It's PG Tips. Are you familiar
Excellent
with that
choice.
brand?
Yes, it's a very solid brand.
My brother Tom gave me that for Christmas, and I understand it's quite popular in a country that I've been to 9 times because I love the English people and I love England itself, so I'm having that. But I'm also having just a plain glass of water because I happen to be pretty serious asthmatic. And I'm one of those people that even if I'm standing at a podium speaking to a lot of people, I'm carrying one of those little water bottles, those plastic water bottles, because I occasionally have to slurp a little water in the middle of something, but I hope it doesn't happen today.
Well, what we'll do with our drinks is toast a gold-level Patreon supporter. And since we don't actually have any new Patreon supporters this week, I thought we would toast all of the 30 or so writers who contributed to your book, since they were an integral part of it.
Oh my goodness, we couldn't have had the book without them.
So to everyone who contributed to this book, thank you for your words, by which you've helped us come to know Jack better. May you always continue to shine a light where it's needed. Cheers.
Cheers.
So, Carolyn, I like to begin most interviews by finding out where our guests first came upon Lewis. Well, what was your story?
I really began reading Lewis, I would say, when I was in my 20s in graduate school. And although my schooling was in journalism, it didn't really have anything to do with Lewis, but that happened to be the time period. But, you know, I really have to say that I didn't appreciate him until I had been, had a lot more life experience, just plain life experience. He's so deep and so interesting and really so relevant that it probably wasn't until, a few dark nights of the soul had been in my life and that kind of thing. And I had been through lots more life experience and was maybe even as late as my 40s or something when I really, really began to get into him in a bigger way. And then finally just turned a huge corner when I went to England and actually stayed at the Kilns for the first time. I've been there several times, and this first time I stayed at the Kilns, I was doing something with the C.S. Lewis Foundation. They were sponsoring a seminar that I attended, and that actually was just it just was a life-changing experience for me, and it's really where the inception of the book started.
And that's a coming together of both your interest in Lewis and also your background in journalism and literature. Would you mind us filling in on a few of the details for our listeners to understand your background coming to this book?
Okay, you mean my background as a writer and a journalist and that kind of thing? Thank you for asking. I had what I just consider to be a wonderfully fun, interesting career, and the part that people usually want to hear the most about are my years on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., because, that's a wild and crazy place. But before I even got there, I had worked in several companies. When you have journalism degrees, of course, you also can work in corporate, settings, and I was with several of those. I even taught journalism for a while at a college. I had done work with church denominations at their, corporate headquarters and that kind of thing. So, but when I got to Washington, D.C., oh my goodness, I don't even know where to begin with that. The years that I was there, just to kind of tell you the four administrations, I did not work for the administrations, you understand. I was a regular working journalist on the Hill, but it was the last of Carter, Reagan, Bush 1, and the two Clinton administrations. So that's the time period.
Wonderful. And you were sort of put on the map through an article in Sports Illustrated. Is that correct?
That's a crow. You want me to tell that? That is a fun story. Okay, I'll do that. I was asked by a group of, lobbyists is what they really were, and I came to learn that lobbyists are not the kind of, bad, horrible people I had really sort of thought, and maybe some of your listeners may have that idea. They're just regular people who are trying to support the industry that they work for. And this was during the Reagan administration that they were reauthorizing through Congress, as has to be done every X number of years, the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. So bills are going through, and there's a lot of discussion about all that. And this consortium of a group of people that represented these industries hired me to write a book on, of all things, acid rain. Because there was, some evidence and some thought, and some of the thought disagreed with this, that acid rain was causing the rivers and the streams and the lakes and even the Chesapeake Bay and places like that to be polluted. And of course, there were different points of view on that, frankly. So I remember that the person who was the publisher of the book described me as a research journalist, and I just thought to myself, gosh, is there any other kind of journalist when you think about it? But so I researched and, of course, interviewed just all these people that were scientists and engineers and so forth. And this little book came out, which is really very obscure, but it got a lot of coverage, and it was called What We Know About Acid Rain. I guess it got passed around Capitol Hill. And one day I got a call on the phone from Sports Illustrated magazine. Well, they were doing this huge article. In fact, it was a cover story called An American Tragedy. I understand people can still get it online. And it was all about that issue because of sports fishing. I mean, the tie-in, of course, was using the lakes and rivers and so forth for sports fishing. So they wanted to interview me and use some quotes, and along with some other people's quotes, obviously. But the part that was just so funny to me is they wanted to photograph me, because these were the days that you didn't see a lot of women in Sports Illustrated unless they were in a swimsuit. But I was in a dress for success business suit for women in my photo in Sports Illustrated. And then they had about a column and a half of quotes from me. But that kind of put me on the map, on the Hill, in terms of being someone that I could, who could come up with different kinds of writing and so forth. I mean, you could have a conversation like that with someone over a cup of coffee, and just kind of right away they would think, okay, you're the one to write this or write that or cover this or cover that. And it was just a fun, crazy event. And so that happened. I still have my copy of the issue. I wish I'd bought several.
Well, let's talk about your most recent book, which is Women and C.S. Lewis, What His Life and Literature Reveal for Today's Culture. Now, I first came across this book when I was at a Lewis conference in LA, and I actually met your co-editor, Dr. Mary Pomeroy Key, got her to sign a copy of the book for my wife, then girlfriend, Marie. And I was really happy to see that this book existed. And it was really lovely to see such a range of voices responding to this question about women and C.S. Lewis. That was a while ago, but as listeners will know, I'm an avid audiobook listener. And so it was with great joy that just a few weeks ago, I noticed Audible added an audio version of your book.
Yes.
How did that come about?
Oh my goodness, that was a complete surprise. I mean, first of all, just to explain a little bit about the publication of it, it's published in Oxford at a publishing house with this fabulous name for anybody, dealing with C.S. Lewis, Lion Hudson Publishing Company. In fact, it shares the building with OUP, and that's a real cool part of it. But suddenly I was just on christianbook.com one day, just literally a few months ago, and I discovered that it had become an audiobook. So I checked with my longtime literary agent to see if he knew anything about it. He had no idea, and evidently they had just decided to do that. So, of course, I was thrilled, and I ordered a copy, and in fact, I was just listening to it before we started to just kind of get my head around it, and it's just one of those serendipitous things that I ran across, as I say, on christianbook.com one day and ordered, and it's very high quality. That's beautifully done. Has the same cover that is actually a photograph that we got from Doug Gresham that he took himself of his mother and stepfather.
It blows my mind that somebody would put out an audiobook and not actually contact the author.
Well, I was delightfully surprised. I did kind of, scratch my head about that a little bit, but that's okay. I mean, the book we knew the book was getting traction, as they say. There's been lots of invitations to speak on it. We get a lot of good feedback and so forth. So it wasn't a complete surprise because that's, another medium. I mean, people like to listen to books in their car. I have a Bose that I listen to in my kitchen, for example, and I can, pop in the little CDs. And so it's a lovely idea.
It was also very serendipitously timed because recently I've listened to several other podcasts that have been talking about Lewis and very freely and very liberally throwing out around words like problematic, sexist, and misogynist. Now, over the course of listening to some of these episodes, I would often notice that the people saying these things weren't actually that familiar with Lewis's life, generally unaware of his larger corpus, and also just didn't read his works particularly carefully, instead preferring to import their own baggage into the text instead. But I was wondering what the genesis of this book was. Was it in response to hearing similar sorts of criticisms?
Okay, that's an interesting story too, and it really has to do with that time I stayed at the Kilns that I mentioned. I was just overhearing a couple of men who were attending the seminar just like I was, and they were kind of gossiping, about Lewis. And I knew they loved Lewis because, they had come there just like I had, and I'd been meeting them, during the course of the seminar. But they were just standing there saying, "Have you heard that? Have you heard that?" And, they were just so, a journalist has a thing called a nose for news. And that is actually a thing, let me assure you. It is a thing. And I sort of butted into their conversation and I said, "What are you talking about?" Because I immediately thought of probably the same thing many of your listeners, think of, which is, of course, that he married Joy, who is just brilliant off the charts, just exactly the kind of woman that a guy who's a sexist would run from. And I thought about, examples like Lucy, the little girl of 4 children. He could pick to be the one to recognize who Aslan was. He picks one of the girls, and just on and on and on and on. I could just think immediately. And I just realized that this was something that needed to be followed up on, because I had seen so much in my journalism work. I had been just noticing over, a long period of time that the world was becoming so much more secular. And one of the cleverest tricks in promoting that kind of secular, anti-Christian culture is to target a guy like C.S. Lewis, who is just so well known for that. I mean, even though you see the names of his books on, the list of the bestsellers in Britain and in America, of course, you still realize that some of those people are probably snickering and thinking that, if they believe those rumors. And I couldn't sit still without investigating this. And, so I did sort of investigative reporting, I guess you would say. But do you mind if I go on and explain how I decided to do it in a little different way than, I'd
No,
like to be able
totally
to give
great.
this to you, because this is a little different. Instead of the kind of book where a journalist would say, David Bates, so what do you think about C.S. Lewis's attitudes toward girls and women, and you give me sentence after sentence after sentence, and I quote you in paragraph after paragraph, hopefully, through a book, but the book is written in my voice, if you see what I'm saying. I'm seen as the writer of it. I didn't want to do that. I've done that in other books, of course, but I wanted this to be something. I wanted it to do several things. I wanted it to kind of allow newer Lewis people who may have heard something like that and been, turned off by it, of course, which I would think they should be if they really believed it. I wanted them to learn the scholars, learn the people who were really authorities on Lewis, and I wanted to find out who they were. And this was an idea that I just saw as working much better for a structure of the book, was to have the people write individual chapters. Now, I would put together, chapter groupings under categories, so that there would be sections, so that the people could just go off and explain what it was that they knew about this that would refute this. Of course, I had to find people that agreed with it, and just about everyone that is a scholar, a real true scholar on Lewis, agreed that he was absolutely not a sexist, that he took the Lord's point of view on on women. He was a product of his time, of course. There's that, but he still saw women as fellow servants in the kingdom, just like he was, and he really he was just very enlightened. But I also wanted these chapters to have biographies of these writers, so that these newer people that I thought would be coming to Lewis because of things like Narnia, but who would have maybe been turned off because of this crazy rumor that seemed to be going around, I wanted them to really get to know, the people that were doing the writing. That was how it kind of, wound up. And frankly, one of my big jobs was just kind of keeping the people in their lanes. I mean, not everyone could talk about Joy or Lucy or, some of the obvious things like that. And it was just a wonderful, wonderful project. I just can't tell you how much I enjoyed it. And I'm kind of itching to do something else now. We'll see.
I'll definitely say I really liked the little bios at the end of each chapter and the inclusion of a picture of the person speaking, because particularly when you're reading a book where you have 30 or so voices, it's very easy for them all just to blur into one unless you've got a picture to attach it to. But let's actually talk about some of the contributors, because it was what I noticed when I first looked at the table of contents of the book. There's a real mix of people. There were a lot of scholarly names that I knew, people like Dr. Michael Ward, and there were other people that I wasn't so familiar with. And I mean, you were clearly scraping the bottom of the barrel, because I noticed the name Andrew Lazo included there.
Oh, yes, Andrew Lazo. A wild man, if there ever was one. Gosh, he did a great job. He did a great job. He really did. He tackled Till We Have Faces.
Ooh, what a surprise. We're going to have to pause for the collective gasp of all of our listeners.
Oh, yes. And will he please, 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 please finish his big project, the book on Till We Have Faces? Please, Andrew, if you're listening, do that. Well, I may as well. I've got a fun story about Andrew. Can I bring that up? Because I invited someone else to be in the book that.
Yes, I heard about this. Please tell the people who else was on this book.
Oh, yes. Well, there's a lot of other people. I'll get into that in a minute. But let me tell you a fun story that'll just to be clever, and it happened just about like this. Of course, I was invited then to be on radio programs, and I insisted that the other people, I mean, the real, writers of this book are all of these many people who agreed to do this. I mean, really, my role and Mary Pomeroy Key was a great help. Also, I'm so grateful that she decided to join me, and I would recommend, by the way, sometime that you do an interview with her about her work with the C.S. Lewis Study Center. She's the director of that. It's in Northfield, Massachusetts. I think your listeners would love to hear about that. But I was really doing the editing of the chapters and so forth, and I had come to know the people so much better if they weren't already friends of mine, and I wanted them to be on the radio too. I mean, especially if they weren't, like an Alistair McGrath or a Randy Alcorn or people like that who by the way, it's kind of funny, sometimes the bigger the name, the easier they really are to deal with. I mean, those guys and several others that are in the book were just fabulously wonderful to, they'd say, oh, just do whatever you want with what I'm sending you. Let me see it when it's finished if you don't mind, but just very casual about it. But so anyway, I invited several other people. There were a number of these radio interviews, and in one of them, I invited Andrew to be on it and a woman named Kristen Ditchfield. Well, little did I know that Andrew was paying close attention to what Kristen was saying, and I wouldn't have been able to tell this because if you know what a wild man he was texting me during the whole thing, and I'm trying to pay attention to the woman who's in Tucson, Arizona, interviewing us, and she was kind of looking to me as the master of ceremonies, in terms of, saying, well, Andrew, what do you say about that? Or Kristen, why don't you pipe up and say something, and so forth. And the next thing I know, and it wasn't too long later, it was, certainly a proper amount of time, Andrew and Kristen came to me at an event that Kristen and I go to usually, and they announced they were going to get married. They had never even heard of each other before they were on this radio interview with me. And they did, and so now her name is incorrect in the book. It is simply Kristen Ditchfield. And I guess we're going to have to put out a whole other edition that says Kristen Ditchfield Lazo.
That is really wonderful. It's a good way to find a wife. Co-author a book.
Yeah, well, I mean, you're a married man. You understand that process. So, yeah, their engagement picture actually is the cutest thing. It shows them peeking over the book at each other, looking at each other, and the book is open. So I'm very happy that they provided that.
That is adorable. I'm going to have to track that down. So you've got all of these different authors. As editor and co-editor, you are trying to wrangle them all. What was your target audience for this book? Was there a particular kind of person that you had in mind? Because I noticed that there's a real popular tone. It is really readable. You have top-notch scholars on here, but I can understand what they're saying.
Oh, good for you. And thanks for using the word wrangle, since I live in Texas. That's a good Texas
You're welcome.
One of the things I really, really wanted to do was have the book be in popular voice. The popular voice, which you recognized when we had our little natter before this even started, is something that does not use the heavy duty, it doesn't overuse all of the footnoting and that kind of thing. It's kind of woven in. I mean, several people really did a great job of that. Don W. King, when he wrote about why did Lewis marry Joy Davidman rather than Ruth Pitter, he's one of the guys who really caught the popular voice, and several other people that just did such a great job with it. Crystal Hurd did. She wrote on flora, and this is the kind of writing where you would, if you're supposed to talk about Flora, who is, of course, Lewis's mother, you would stick to that subject. But we decided the thing to do is to admit right up front that does take two people to raise a child, ideally. And so Albert is is very much in the chapter as well. I mean, he's not ignored. Whereas, in maybe a more scholarly voice, you would perhaps leave out that or something because you'd have to be just so focused. And like so many of the people who were in this book, they admitted to me they really loved, writing in the popular voice instead of the scholarly voice, because it just was fun to them. I can't tell you how many emails I got back from people saying, wow, I'm really glad you turned me loose in this voice, but the real reason for that is I wanted this to be accessible to these people who are just plain fans of C.S. Lewis. I mean, he has been dead for quite a few years now, and it's possible that his popularity could wane. And now this explaining about him as a non-sexist, non-misogynist does not really have to do specifically with the women's movement. And it certainly didn't have anything to do with like the Me Too movement or some of those things that have been around recently, because nobody was accusing him of, any of that kind of behavior. But I realized that when people open books that are just plain fans and they see tons of, footnoting and just that kind of thing where the writer is not really owning their own opinion. I mean, they just feel like they always have to say, according to so-and-so, I was influenced to think this and that and the other. So that was really one of my goals, was to get at those just regular readers who might have turned away from C.S. Lewis and missed, the joy, let's say, of all that he's written.
So at this point, it might be an idea to talk through the book a little bit. When people open it up, they'll see it's divided into a number of sections, as you mentioned. 5 sections talking about Lewis the man, the fiction author, the poet, the influencer, and the mentor. What do you cover in each of these sections? And if you could maybe give us a few tidbits and a few teasers of what listeners will discover when they open your book.
Sure. I won't try to mention every single one of the people that are in the book. They'll find that out. They are people who are in many cases well known, but in several cases they're newer people that the readers will not be familiar with. And I really specifically wanted to bring those people in so that they would just have a chance to opine on this themselves, whether they're well known or not. But for example, Crystal Hurd talks about his mother, Flora, who, as people know, was a very brilliant woman, a graduate of Belfast University and the study of math and logics. And, a woman who studied something like mathematics is not exactly someone who's going to raise a son who would turn out to be a sexist. So there's a good data point right there for our premise.
Although she did also manage to produce a son that wasn't very good at mathematics.
Well, that's good, yes. Oh, golly, he barely got into Oxford, that's absolutely the truth. But Crystal Hurd, did address also Albert. We decided we ought to take the point of view, which is a natural point of view, I think, that it certainly is in an ideal world, 2 parents who raise a child, and Albert, certainly had a great influence too. So let me just dip through a few of these. It was Lyle Dorset who did the actual chapter on joy. Paul McCusker, I think I mispronounced his name first time, did the one on Mrs. Moore, and he did not, avoid some of the controversial things about that at all. He explains that in, I think, brilliantly, and does a great job. Don W. King does one on, he calls it Fire and Ice. Why did Lewis marry Joy Davidman rather than Ruth Pitter? Ruth Pitter, of course, was a great poet. He was very influenced. Lewis was very influenced by her. She was kind of his mentor. Both of the Downings are in the book, and Crystal Downing did the first one that is on Dorothy L. Sayers, one of Lewis's best friends, and then a little bit lesser known, what I like to call a newer voice, Casey Macenti, did one later in the book, also on Dorothy L. Sayers. We mixed in several people that are slightly lesser known people. I mean, just maybe haven't published a book yet, but are very opinionated and well respected on their knowledge. Alistair McGrath, oh my goodness, he showed up in spades. And if you know that expression, he did the one on the Inklings and Lewis's blindness to gender. He was absolutely a delight to deal with. And he just really explained why the Inklings, did not have women, and yet how Lewis was known to be blind to gender. I really encourage people to read that one. Colin Duryea, I have to tell you, he gets the award for the best chapter title. His is C.S. Huh? You want to hear it? It's
Yes.
C.S. Lewis and the friends who apparently couldn't really have been his friends, but actually were. And he just listed all of these women who who were in some way influential to Lewis, but were just friends. That in some cases they're kind of well-known people, and in other cases they're not. And he does several paragraphs on each one. In the second section, of course, we have Devin Brown, who talks about the Chronicles of Narnia. He's very well known as an authority on Narnia, but he actually names the names of these people who said that Lewis could have been a sexist, including J.K. Rowling, who is the person who came up with the Great Wizard and always gives Lewis a lot of credit for influencing her. And I couldn't imagine that she, among the others, would have done that, but anyway, she did. So Stephen Elmore, who is the president of the C.S. Lewis Foundation now, is the one who did The Abolition of Woman, is the name of his.
Clever.
Isn't that good? Yes, Gender and Hierarchy in Lewis's Space Trilogy. Dr. Joy Jordan Lake does a good one, where she talks about the Great Divorce. David C. Downing did Pilgrim's Paradox, where he talks about Pilgrim's regress. We have Andrew Lazo on Till We Have Faces, The Four Loves, and some other works he brings in. And then we have three poets in a section on poetry. A man named Brad Davis, another slightly newer voice, a woman named Kelly Belmonte, and a man that everyone who knows C.S. Lewis knows and loves, Reverend Dr. Malcolm Guite of Cambridge University. In section 4, we call that Lewis the Influencer, how his life and literature impact the 21st century discussion about women. People must read a wonderful chapter by Dr. Monica Hilder. She's at a university in Canada, and she just really opens this up with, she's very well known for her writings on his work with women, or his attitudes toward women, and she basically comes right out and says, it is not Lewis who's sexist, we are. Love that. And Dr. Mary Poplin and Brett McCracken and Reverend Dr. Jeanette Sears, who was the first woman, I believe, ordained as a priest in England, and she talks about, for example, she respectfully disagrees on Lewis's famous essay on women as priests. So there's lots of points of view over here, and in fact, here's an opposing point of view to that one. Kathy Keller, who is also known as Mrs. Tim Keller. I hate to ever introduce a woman by her husband's name, but in this case, I think I'll go ahead and do so. And I think Kathy would agree with that. Another delightful person to deal with.
You could maybe introduce her as C.S. Lewis's pen friend, Kathy Keller.
Yes. She was a pen pal to Lewis. She was one of the children who would write to Lewis. And he would, of course, as you know, famously, he would always just write back to everyone. Everyone got a letter in return. And so she has some very interesting opinions about women's roles in the church. And she not only tells about her being a pen pal, but that. And here again, we do not shy away from the subject of sex. Dr. Holly Ordway writes on that. And so does Dr. Michael Ward of Oxford. I believe he's at Trinity, isn't he? Isn't that right? Well, they were both delightful to deal with. I hate to point out some and make it seem like nobody was hard to deal with on this. In fact, everybody wanted to jump on board. It was a delight to just call up people and find out, oh yes, I would love to do that. What would you like me to do? Just pick out something. And, it was just so nice to hear people doing that.
This is good to know because we've had a lot of these people on the show, and the people we haven't had on the show, I'm planning to have them on the show. So it's good to know that they're very amenable.
Oh, they really, really were. This was just the kind of project that you look back on and you think, God's hand had to be on it from beginning to end because it just flowed so smoothly, and it really did. As I've mentioned, Casey Macenti is one of the slightly lesser known people, but she wrote on the second chapter on Dorothy L. Sayers. I mean, the relationship Sayers and Lewis had was well worth 2 chapters, and that's just one of the great data points. And then the last section is on Lewis the mentor, how his views on women impact mine. Randy Alcorn did, he speaks out a lot for women, and so he did a whole chapter on that. John Stonestreet wrote on the weight of glory, and Kristen Ditchfield, who has written many, many, many books, a lot of them on Narnia and other Lewis-related issues. And now I should say her name properly, Kristen Ditchfield Lazo. And so she wrote this chapter, More Than a Fairy Princess, What Narnia Teaches About Being Strong, Courageous Women. And then both Mary and I did beginning chapters, and I did a concluding chapter, and I did include a few other people in that. Let me just go ahead and honor them with their names as well. There are people whose contributions are included in this, but they've spoken out a lot on the subject, or they've written books on the subject. Dr. Carol M. Swain, Randy Singer, Lancia E. Smith, David Holland, of your country, by the way, and Lisa Ledry Aguilar. So, and we do have questions for reflection and discussion at the end, so we can make, a nice group study or course. Actually, as a course, I will tell you, I have had more feedback on people who've used this book as, from professors who have said, I'm using your book in my class, or students who have done like a master's thesis or a doctoral dissertation on this subject and, of course, cited the book.
That's wonderful. How do you even set about doing a project like this, trying to coordinate this many people? Did you approach people asking them what they would like to talk about, or did you let them all fight it out in a massive battle royale?
Interesting question. Let me think how that worked. I did have to, as I say, kind of keep them in their lanes, because sometimes people would agree, yes, I'll write on that subject, but they would sort of ease over into some of the other subjects a little bit. And everyone was very cooperative. I must tell you, that was another thing. I at one point when I realized what I had taken on, and this, I imagined just losing friends with these people. If I can say, the people, like they either were already people I knew from conferences I'd been to or something like that, or they were new friends or whatever. But no, everyone actually was very amenable. I mean, they caught the vision that this needed to work together. And but I did have to do some negotiating, and that's fine. It's part of the fun.
So to sort of wrap things up, how would you summarize it? If someone comes to you and says, I've heard these things about C.S. Lewis, that he was a sexist and misogynistic kind of guy, how would you respond in 2 minutes?
Oh my goodness, in 2 minutes? Oh, I hate time frames like that. He was, a man of great faith. And so naturally, his point of view is the Lord's point of view. He definitely was a product of his time. I mean, there's no getting around the fact that he grew up in the time that he did, the Edwardian era and so forth. But he really had a genuine friendship with many women, and in his literature, when you examine it, as we did in this book, you see that he treated women and girls as equals, and especially as servants in the kingdom, just like himself.
Wonderful. Carolyn, thank you for coming on the show today and talking to us about this project. For those who would like to find out more about you and maybe pick up a copy of the book or the audiobook, where should they go?
It's available on Amazon. As I say, that's where I found the audiobook, was on christianbook.com, not on Amazon actually, but it is on both of those. And Barnes & Noble, all of those kinds of publishing outlets. If they want to read more about maybe the background of my journey toward the long and winding road, I'm that generation. I had to say that. So I would suggest maybe they go on my website and they can look at About Carolyn, or another one called The Story. That's another tab which really does give that background. Oh, and a very cool thing I've got on that tab is a wonderful photo of what's called the new building that is, where Lewis taught at Oxford at Magdalen College. And of course, that's, holy ground for Lewisians like yourself and myself and all your wonderful listeners.
And it's new only in terms of Oxford. It is still very old.
Relative, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that website was carolyncurtis.net. We'd like to thank all of our top-tier supporters: Jake, Stephen, Matt, Jeff, Chris, John, James, Kate, and Rowdy. Also, if you have a woman in your life who loves Scotch, why not purchase her a laser-etched Pints per Jack glass? I think she would really appreciate it. And I'd encourage everyone to share this episode on social media, particularly wherever you hear folks opining about C.S. Lewis and women. And please join us next time, when we'll be going further up
and further in.
Cheers.
Cheers.